Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 4 The Clearing. The moon was hidden, obscured by dense clouds as Eric and Hoke made their way through the dark forest. The woods were thick around them, the path they walked, little more than a game trail, suddenly appearing before them and quickly disappearing behind, swiftly swallowed up by the inky darkness of the night. Eric was thankful for the cover, all the better to hide their movements. A steady breeze harangued the treetops, causing the branches to creak and bend under the onslaught. He found this to be another boon, helping to mask their footfalls and giving convenient excuses to the small sounds made in their passage through the brush. Eric had spent much of the day in silent meditation. He had tried and failed to find peace from the storm of thoughts and emotions raging within his mind. He was thankful to be out of the cave and moving toward his goal. The repetitive act of placing one foot before the other gave his mind a task with which to grapple, a futile attempt at grasping whatever distraction presented itself, no matter how mundane. As they walked, his thoughts returned to what Hoke had said about the powers of the Chosen, that they could wield magic by force of will alone. Eric sighed in disdain. How was he to focus his will on a task he didn't understand? Was he meant to simply be a butcher of this invading army? An immortal killer seeking to pacify the land by carrying the biggest, bloodiest sword? Eric was revolted by the idea, but it gave him cause to find a better way. There was still much that he didn't understand, but one thing was certain. There would be no sweet release of death, no peaceful oblivion waiting in the beyond. Not for the Chosen. For better or worse, they were forced to live with the consequences of their actions. He glanced over his shoulder. Hoke followed a short distance behind. The Farron had been mostly silent after waking, quietly packing his kit while the pair waited for the last of the sun's dying rays to finally wilt. Once upon the trail, Eric had been impressed by the Farron's competency as they swiftly made their way through the dense trees. Eric found it difficult to judge distances in the forest, but he felt that they had put several miles between themselves and the cave when suddenly the trail opened upon a broad clearing of tall grasses and sparsely vegetated trees. Steep rock walls rose from short boulder-strewn talus slopes on either side of the clearing. The pale stone walls glowed with a ghostly luminance against the darkness of the night. It gave the clearing an ethereal, otherworldly look, as patches of fog hung in the air above the tall grasses. The fog stirred as a light breeze passed through the clearing. It swirled and danced around the trees, their gnarled and twisted branches barely visible against the darkness of the cloudy night sky. Eric turned and crouched while he waited for Hoke to catch up. The Farron surveyed the clearing and cursed under his breath. Not much cover, and the cliff walls on either side cut off any chance of skirting around the clearing, said Hoke, shaking his head. I don't like this one bit. It's a natural funnel, a perfect place for an ambush. Eric nodded in agreement, a grim look on his face. This close to the mountains, the forest became a maze of ravines, rocky bluffs, and sheer cliffs. Retreat held no promise of respite from the danger. I don't think we have any other options, said Eric. The Farron continued to gaze out over the clearing. It looks to be about 500 yards. The tall grass will help conceal us if we stay low. Follow me, said Hoke. He crept forward at a hunch and entered the grassy clearing. Eric followed a short distance behind, walking at a crouch. Were he to stand, the grasses would reach up to his chest. Hoke made slow progress before him. The taller man had to crouch that much lower to keep the hood of his cloak from sticking above the grasses and wildflowers of the clearing. They crawled along for what felt like hours, daring not to raise their heads. They pushed on, gaining ground across the clearing, inch by stubborn, painful inch. Eric's legs and back burned as tired muscles protested the prolonged abuse. Eric stopped as he noticed himself gaining upon the Farron. He knelt and reached forward with his arms, stretching his back. The smell of damp soil filled his nose as his face hovered scant inches above the ground. A small movement caught Eric's eye. Mere inches before him, a field mouse struggled to work a large seed into its already overburdened cheeks. The mouse suddenly dropped the seed and scurried away into the surrounding grass as the moon peeked out from behind the clouds, bathing the clearing in bright moonlight. Eric cursed their rotten luck as he glanced over his shoulder. The moon wavered in and out of view as the thick cloud cover began to break apart. Movement on the talus slope beyond the edge of the clearing drew his eye. Perched upon a nearby boulder stood an archer, his bow drawn back and trained upon Hoke. Eric swiftly stood and raised his arms as the archer released his projectile. He heard the twang of the bowstring a moment before feeling pain explode in his left shoulder. The impact of the arrow spun him, causing Eric to stumble forward and fall into the tall grass as a half-dozen soldiers swarmed them. To a man, they were garbed in scarlet tunics, worn leather armor, and conical steel helms. They carried buckler shields and wickedly curved swords. Hoke stood and drew his sword in a single fluid motion. He spun on his heel and took an advancing soldier in the throat. He slashed wildly and the other attackers gave him a wide berth but quickly encircled the Farron as Hoke glanced from side to side. He balanced lightly on the balls of his feet as he waited for the soldiers to make their move. Again, the mob advanced and again Hoke's sword flashed in the moonlight. Another attacker fell in a spray of blood as Hoke wielded his longsword with expert skill. The soldiers again fell back as they weighed their next attack. Eric silently rose from the grass and approached the mob from behind, his staff at the ready. The nearest man turned as Eric quickly closed the distance between them. The young chosen leapt forward and lashed out with a vicious front kick that sent the man into flight before crashing into a nearby boulder with a sickening thud. Before the man's cohorts could react, Eric was in their midst, using his stonewood staff to good effect, dealing damage to anybody within striking distance of the heavy weapon's long reach. The soldiers retreated a short distance to regroup. They had lost not only the element of surprise, but half of their force during the brief encounter. Hoke kept his sword at the ready as he eyed the soldiers. "These dogs are scouts from Xeris' army. Don't give them quarter. They won't give it in return," said Hoke. Eric nodded in affirmation. He heard a whooshing sound as another arrow zipped past, narrowly missing his cheek. The archer was still perched upon the boulder, just beyond Zaren's scouts. Bright moonlight illuminated the sniper like a spotlight, shining down upon his rocky perch. The archer waited for a moment as though silently gauging the trajectory of his shot. He calmly drew another arrow from his quiver and fitted it against the bowstring. Raising the weapon, he drew back and released. The arrow closed the distance between them in a flash, but this time Eric was ready. The young chosen spun his staff in a half circle before him, easily knocking the projectile from the air. Eric knelt and picked up a stone the size of his fist. He drew back his arm and threw the rock with all his might. The projectile shot through the dark, taking the archer in his chest and knocking him backwards from his rocky roost. Hoke laughed. "Nice throw." Eric had no time to reply as the remainder of Zaren's men rushed them. The young chosen leapt forward, his staff taking the first soldier across the side of his head, deforming the man's helm and caving his skull. Eric sidestepped and spun, catching another of the scouts in a firm grip. He continued his spin, using the momentum to throw the man across the clearing. His scream was cut short as he crashed into a rocky outcropping with bone-crushing force. Hoke was engaged in a duel with the remaining scout. His sword gleamed in the moonlight as he parried and dodged the enemy combatant's blade. Hoke allowed his opponent to fall into a false sense of security as he worked out the pattern of the man's attack. Suddenly Hoke was inside the scout's guard and the fight was over. Silence once again fell over the clearing. Eric grimaced in pain. With every movement of his left arm, he felt the arrowhead in his shoulder tearing his flesh anew, only for it to heal once again around the embedded projectile. Hoke knelt and wiped his blade on the tunic of the fallen scout at his feet, the fresh blood further darkening the crimson cloth. He stood and motioned for Eric to turn around. "Let's take a look at that arrow wound," said Hoke. Eric obliged, asking the Farron in turn, "Have you had many dealings with this Zarin Zaris' soldiers?" Hoke shook his head in negative. "Only in tales too bloody and horrifying to repeat. The Pirate King's men are naught but butchers. These swine were no warriors," said Hoke, referring to the dead soldiers littering the clearing. "They knew nothing of honor, and they had no code." "Pirate King?" asked Eric. Hoke nodded. "Zarin Zaris made his appearance in Faereyas after sailing an armada through the western gate into the Gellan Sea and sacking Kar-2. After proclaiming himself the king of Kar-2, he began raiding coastal cities and demanding payment for protection from future attacks. Some of the weaker barons bent their knee, but others fought back, refusing to acknowledge his claim over Kar-2 and instead calling him the Pirate King. The Farron suddenly grasped the arrow shaft and snapped it off close to the wound. Eric gasped in pain. "Sorry about that, mate," said Hoke. "Experience has taught me that kind of pain arrives best as a surprise. We'll have to get the arrowhead out later. I know it probably hurts like hell, but we need to move. Who knows how far the sounds of that battle carried?" Hoke looked around the silent clearing. The Ka could be upon us this very moment. "Yes," said a voice from beyond the darkened tree line. "And the Ka would have a word." Hoke drew his sword as a tall figure stepped into the clearing. His black mantis armor drank in the moonlight, giving him the appearance of a shadow come to life. The upswept horns of his helm lent a sinister aspect to his visage as the man stopped and shook his head. He raised a long, slender hand. "I would advise against initiating violence," he cautioned in a voice smooth as silk. "You are far outnumbered. Many times that beyond the battle you've so valiantly won," he added, speaking the Farron tongue with ease. With a motion from the man, the clearing suddenly rang with the sound of several dozen swords clanging against shields. The sound reverberated through the clearing like thunder, its metallic peal echoing off the towering cliff walls. "Lower your weapons and let us speak," said the black-armored man. Hoke kept his sword raised in a defensive position. He clearly wasn't willing to take this man at his word and lower his guard. Eric leaned against his staff as he watched the stranger. He felt no sense of guile in the man. The black-armored man removed his helm and gave a short bow. "My name is Galen, Motavi of the Z-Ka of Charos Fen. You have my word. No harm will come to you by my hand, nor by any of those sworn to my service." Hoke's knuckles tightened upon the hilt of his sword as he stared down the Ka. Eric placed a reassuring hand upon Hoke's arm. "I think it would be best to hear him out," said the young chosen. Hawk's voice sounded in Hoke's mind. "I agree with Eric. Galen is a Motavi, the leader of his clan. He will not give his word lightly." Hoke hesitantly nodded and sheathed his sword, but Eric could see the tension in the Farron's movements. Clearly, trust would be hard won. Galen looked around the clearing for a moment before nodding to himself. "We camp here," he called loudly in his native Ka tongue. His voice echoed between the cliff walls before fading amongst the sounds of his men already hard at work readying their camp. Eric and Hoke were mostly ignored as a trio of Ka approached and set about dragging away the dead Farrons, while another trio built a pyre downwind of the camp. Eric was astonished by the stealthy proficiency of Galen's men as they seemed to suddenly appear from the surrounding vegetation, so akin were they to moving through the terrain. They swiftly disappeared down the darkened trailheads at either end of the clearing, both scouting ahead and covering their rear. "Come, friends," called Galen. Several fires now burned throughout the clearing, casting chaotic shadow play upon the towering walls. The camp buzzed with the sound of activity as Hoke and Eric made their way toward the Ka leader. Hoke gave a brief bow to Galen. "We thank you for both the warmth of your fire and the safety of your countenance. Neither will be soon forgotten," said the Farron, falling back upon his skills as an envoy. "I am Hoke of Taransay. My companion here is Eric of—" His voice trailed off as he glanced at Eric. The young chosen gave a brief nod and Hoke continued. "The Verdant Valleys." Galen laughed. "Taransay and the Verdant Valleys. There are those among my people that would be quick to accuse you of falsehood claiming such birthrights. What brings you so far from home, Hoke of Taransay?" Hoke hesitated for a moment before Hawk's voice again whispered in his mind. Tell him the truth. I'm searching for a route into the verdant valleys. Eric is my guide, said Hoke. Galen held Hoke in his gaze for a moment before replying. You speak truth, but not the full measure, said Galen. The Ka turned toward Eric. You are guiding this man to your homeland? Eric looked Galen in his blue eyes. Yes, though not by the most expedient route, he answered cryptically. Galen silently regarded Eric. The Ka's pale blue eyes were unblinking as they bored into the young chosen, as if by gaze alone Galen could ascertain the truth. Interesting, Galen whispered to himself before continuing. My scouts had been tracking this band for a day and a half, he said as he motioned toward the bodies on the pyre. We were preparing a surprise for them when the two of you arrived. Now you've both proven yourselves formidable fighters, and I thank you for the killing of my enemies. Were these normal times, I would be content to believe the enemy of my enemy to be an ally, if not a friend. But these are not normal times, gentlemen. As we speak, the forces of Zaren Zaris occupy my ancestral lands. My people, those that still count themselves among the living, may well be prisoners locked behind their city walls. So I will ask you again, why are you here? Hoke made to speak, but Eric cut him short, wincing as he moved his left arm. I've promised to guide Hoke to the verdant valleys, but only after I've seen to this army on the steppe, said the young chosen. The Motavi gave a wry smile. Seen to this army? He asked incredulously. I need as many swords as I can muster, but you'd risk much to help a people foreign to you. Why? Asked Galen. I was chosen to help, said Eric. And your people are in need, he finished in a rush. Galen was again silent for a moment before turning to one of his men. Please see to our guest's wound, Kasich, said the Motavi. Let's have a look at that wound, said Kasich. His face was deeply lined by weather and age, and his blue eyes shined brightly in the firelight. Eric nodded, and the old Ka carefully helped him remove his cloak and shirt. Kasich unrolled a small leather kit. It was full of pockets, each holding what looked like flattened spoons of varying widths. Kasich eyed Eric's wound before carefully selecting one of the tools. The pain in Eric's shoulder flared anew as Kasich splashed the wound with liquid from a small ceramic jug. The old Ka handed Eric a thick leather thong. To bite down on, said Kasich. This isn't going to tickle, boy. The Pirate King's archers use barbed arrowheads. They don't come out easily. Kasich set to work, and Eric bit down on the thick leather. Waves of searing pain emanated from his shoulder as Kasich gingerly opened the wound and slid the spoon-like tool inside, slowly working it deeper and deeper into the wound. The old Ka's fingers moved with expert care as he extracted the tool and the arrowhead in tandem, the flattened circular end of the tool effectively negating the arrowhead's barbs. Dark blood gushed from the wound as the arrowhead was finally worked free. Kasich gently wiped the wound clean to begin his first suture when before his eyes the skin pulled itself together and quickly healed over, leaving no trace of the injury. The old Ka stumbled and fell back in surprise. Galen, noticing the exchange, gave him a quizzical look. Kasich looked to his Motavi, his face ashen and bewildered as he shouted in his native tongue, Unscarred! The camp fell silent as the word echoed off the looming cliff walls. A circle of onlookers began to form around the trio as Galen swiftly crossed the camp to offer the elder Ka a hand up. Unscarred, he asked Kasich. The old man only nodded and pointed to Eric's shoulder. The unbroken skin was clearly visible in the moonlight. What do you see, Galen? Asked one of the assembled Ka, speaking their native tongue. Galen ignored the man as he regarded Eric with a look of astonishment. It cannot be, he whispered to himself. The Unscarred is legend. Eric looked the taller man in his eyes as he stood and raised his arms over his head, a short dagger in his right hand. With slow, deliberate movement, he drew the blade along the length of his left forearm, opening a deep cut that bled profusely. The dark red blood looked black beneath the moonlight, glistening like obsidian as it ran down his arm and shoulder. Murmurs of shock and further cries of Unscarred rang through the assembled crowd of Ka warriors as Eric's wound healed before their eyes. You call me Unscarred, but I don't know that name, Eric called to the crowd, speaking the Ka language with ease. I am Eric, the seventh chosen. Galen raised an eyebrow. Curious. Tell me, Eric, the seventh chosen, have you ever heard the Ka legend of the 7 deaths? Eric shook his head in negative, a quizzical look crossing his face. The Matavi shook his head in turn. You speak our tongue, yet know nothing of our ways. What you call the Chosen, we call the Unscarred, said Galen. Hoke looked back and forth between Eric and the Ka as Hawk translated their words in his mind. Come, said Galen, reverting to speaking Farron. There are words that must be spoken, and sights that must be seen. Follow me. Eric and Hoke followed as the Ka Matavi moved through the camp and up the rocky talus slope beyond. They scrambled in silence for several minutes, placing one foot before the other as they climbed ever higher up the slope. Once atop the rise, Galen turned and began to speak. The 7 Deaths, the parable of the Unscarred, is a story we tell our children. Suffice to say, it lives somewhere between myth and legend to our people. Thousands of years ago, in the turbulent years that followed the death of King Faldor and the loss of Karas-In, the Ka were still a unified people, ruled by a council comprised of the Motavis of the 7 clans. The people suffered, for their Motavis were a jealous and covetous lot, more concerned with gaining power over their peers than ruling with a just hand. During this time, a Farron had come to Karas-Fon. He claimed that he had been chosen to help the Ka. The stranger spoke the truth, the proof borne out in his actions as he helped those in need throughout the great forest. Word quickly spread of the stranger's powers, and the people began to believe him their lost king returned. Though he'd proven his good intentions, the Council of Motavis were too entrenched in their distrust to allow anybody to carry such support among the people, especially an outsider, a Farron. He was a threat to their power, so they laid a nefarious plan in place, the 7 Deaths. The council told the stranger that they wished to test his divinity. Each Motavi had contrived a method of death. If he survived, it would prove his divinity. One by one, the stranger survived each death. Defenestration, strangulation. His throat was slit after being run through with a sword. He was drowned and poisoned before they finally burned him at the stake. Every time, he walked away without harm. The council, backed into a corner of their own creation, proclaimed him the Unscarred, a god made flesh. Galen shook his head. You are a curiosity, Eric the Unscarred. I haven't the time nor the inclination to put you through a trial such as the 7 Deaths, but if you wish to meet the Pirate King's army in the field, you just may find your death waiting. Galen raised a gloved finger and pointed to the east. The trio had been away from the blazing bonfires of the camp long enough for their eyes to have adjusted to the darkness of the night. The clouds had long since broken apart and scattered, leaving the landscape bathed in the silvery touch of moonlight. The exposed rock of the mountains around them gleamed white, throwing the dark patches of forest below into stark contrast. Beyond the forest stretched the grassy steppe, the moonlight painting it in mismatched tones of gray. Dotted throughout the steppe were what looked to be stars strewn about the ground. Their lights twinkled and shone bright against the darkness of the night. Campfires of the invading force numbering in the hundreds. Hope caught Eric's eye and the pair exchanged a knowing look. They were deep in it now, and there would be no turning back. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of The Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.